Okay, so for my presentation, I will be discussing Black women and their disproportionate death rates due to ovarian cancer. So as we've talked about in class this semester, we have seen repeating patterns of additional obstacles and barriers against women of color in the US healthcare system, and there has been an exacerbation of negative experiences when approaching and receiving care that comes from those obstacles. So we've talked about medical racism and prejudiced comments, all things that occur in patient-provider relationships and in the ways that the healthcare system targets people of color based on those prejudiced views. And so Black women face additional discrimination and harm from providers in the healthcare system, and this leads to dread and fear, and this lack of trust leads to significant long-term impacts. And so I want to specifically talk about ovarian cancer, which as of 2023 was the 5th leading cause of cancer-related mortality in US women. And so I am arguing that the racism embedded in the US healthcare system yields higher death rates from ovarian cancer in Black women due to resource inaccessibility and systemic inequality. So the first study I want to talk about is from Andrew Lawson, and it's his deprivation and segregation study. So essentially what he did is he examined segregation indices in 11 sites across the US, and he examined these and how they relate to ovarian cancer survival in Black women. So segregation indices are just the way that levels of segregation are studied in different geographical regions. So essentially what he did was determine what regions were most segregated, and then he hypothesized that these regions would have more socioeconomic status disparities, and that this would determine the state of health discrepancies. And so he used a mediation analysis, which is the way that basically one variable affects another, and then that other variable affects a third. So in this case, a more segregated region would then lead to greater disparity in socioeconomic status across populations, and that this variation or disparity in socioeconomic status would lead to greater disparity in health quality. And so as he found that as socioeconomic status increased in Black women, so does the chance of survival despite ovarian cancer diagnosis. And this ranged from as much of a 25 to 56% increase. And so I want to continue this discussion of this study, connecting it to intersectionality. So as we just talked about, as socioeconomic status increases, so do chances of survival. And this occurs in Black women as well as other counterparts. And so it's important to note that Black women are not a homogeneous group, and that just like any other group or demographic of people that we've talked about, there is still variety in other identities in the Black women community. And so it's important to acknowledge that there are other health determining identities and social determinants of health alongside race and ethnicity that also provide some variability in this data. So the next study I want to talk about is from Justin Chang, and this is talking about the way in which non-Hispanic Black and white women react to post-primary treatment. And so he was studying the way that women responded to surgeries or platinum-based chemotherapy. And essentially he found that there was no difference in the way that Black and white women responded to these. But he knew that there was a significantly more prevalent rates of death in Black women from ovarian cancer than white women. And so he then came to the conclusion that this is because access to quality care is partially responsible for race-specific survival differences, and that it's not the care that is received, but it's the lack of accessibility to it in the first place. That's what causes this discrepancy. And he provides an example of lack of insurance and how a lot of Black women don't have access to local treatments as a result of not having insurance coverage. And so there is a lower overall survival rate among non-Hispanic Black women compared to white women, but there is alongside a significantly increased mortality in Black women because of this inaccess. And so I wanted to highlight these two charts here. So They're talking about the extent of regional versus distant ovarian cancer, which basically talks about where the cancer is located. Regional is in the pelvic region, and distant is anywhere that the cancer is metastasized. And so we can see in both of these, with the dotted line on top being white women and the black line at the bottom representing black women, we see that black women are much more likely to survive for a shorter period of time, and that their chances or probability of survival are much lower across the board. And then the last study I want to focus on is this strong black woman paradox, which involved semi-structured interviews with over 60 women. And essentially, they were talking about black women's experiences with ovarian cancer and their family members, and like what experiences and like lifestyle challenges they had. And so the researchers in this study came to three main themes. One being that challenges should be handled on one's own to minimize burden. Two, that cultural expectations to be strong prevail in Black communities, and that it's important to learn to be more vulnerable and increase support systems to increase beneficial treatment. And so once again, we see that Black women are more than 40% likely to die from ovarian cancer compared to white counterparts. And breast and ovarian cancers combined are the leading cause of cancer death among Black women, and that this study was from 2019. And so there's a couple concepts from class that I want to talk about connected to those themes. So the first one is individualism. And this quote that's provided from the study talks about how Black women can't focus too heavily on their diagnosis. They have to carry on their life. And it kind of reminds me of this whole individualistic neoliberal approach, and this idea that because society marginalizes these people and pushes them to the side, they don't receive that interconnectedness and that community support from any majority groups. And so they have to fend for themselves in a way to maintain survival. And so, of course, given that they have to do that, that fend for yourself individualistic nature is going to thrive, because unfortunately that's the defense mechanism that they have to adhere to. And then with cultural norms, it's kind of similar to that idea that there's an expectation for these Black women, and if they don't uphold it, then they will fail because they have to fight harder to survive. And if they aren't able to upkeep this persona of a strong Black woman, which is the only way that they're accepted in the majority of society, then they're failing. And then this also connects to the idea of weathering, just basically in the idea that over time, with this expectation that Black women are supposed to be strong and they're supposed to be relentless and more resilient, that this is going to increase their survival. But in reality, this is not true. They are, of course, apt to so much more discrimination and harm. And so with this, they become weaker and they don't have as much of a foundational support system. And so it makes it much more difficult to carry on basic life functions, and therefore accessing care is more difficult. And so I want to wrap up this presentation by saying that systemic inequalities take on numerous different forms, from insurance coverage to the level of segregation in one's environment, and that Black women are consistently at higher risk of mortality due to both interpersonal and institutionally enforced structures. Thank you.